So Ronny, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. You've got a really interesting background, as well as having a really interesting product that your company has today. So we've got a bunch of questions that we're going to talk about, and I think this is going to be really useful for people at Waterloo. You've had a really interesting career, as I said. It's spanned both creative and technical areas. So I'm keen to understand, what that path has been and how that's got you to where you are today.
Sure. My background, so I started out always kind of an engineering kid, mixed some arts, and the intersection for me actually came through science fiction. So science fiction was a super driver of both the imagination, but also kind of trying to make a technical reality of that. It kind of came together for me in the world of visual effects and special effects for cinema. So, heavily influenced by the early Star Wars and the like. I ended up during my my time, I did my undergraduate in computer science and mechanical engineering at MIT. And while I was there, had a couple of pretty special opportunities that, I got very, very lucky working, it's continued to be interested in the cinema. And my luck came through in the sense of, spending some summers out in Hollywood, and then fell into a science advisory role, working for art departments out there on a couple of different films that had some care about science. And so after undergraduate, and spent some time in Los Angeles working in the film industry. Ultimately, what happened for me was like a sense that, actually seeing how the sausage is made makes me honestly, frankly, amazed that there are good movies made, considering how it's made. And I felt like personally, I wasn't growing enough, wasn't learning enough, wasn't contributing some real value to society as a whole, and wanting to, not atrophy my brain. So I came back to graduate. And in graduate school back at MIT in computer science, it was still a pull towards the arts that for me manifest in, not in cinema, but in writing, in theater. And then sort of just out of grad school, starting a company that is Tulip, which is what we're doing today. So for me, the kind of the artistic side of me, unfortunately, just doesn't have the time to, fully come to fruition. And I think that, between my first and second retirements, I think there's more opportunity there.
And at the same time, as you've described, your work has been creative. You're a playwright, and so you have done you do creative things, but at the same time, clearly you have a high level of technical knowledge, and those two together, it seems to me, would be very well suited to being a technology innovator yourself, and that, I think, is what has influenced or driven your creation of your company Tulip. Do you feel that to be true? Or?
Well, I think that the skill set that comes from the creative endeavor of dramatic storytelling is very relevant in developing a product, and in a couple of different ways. So my creative training initially is actually in directing. For theater, and which is honestly the hardest thing I've ever done, harder than any engineering thing I've ever done. And the challenge there is, how do you tell a coherent story that is ultimately addressing a core, the answer to the question, what is this play about? In a more meaningful way, not in a factual plot way, but in the transformation of the characters on stage, and that leads to a continuous question of like, in any scene, in any moment, what is the importance of that to the fundamental goal, and how that relates to answering the question of what is this play about, right? And when you think about this, how does that translate to a product perspective? Is in the designing of a product, you are doing, at some, when you're thinking about it, you're doing some kind of storytelling. The storytelling that you're doing is the experience of the user of that product. And like you can have, apply the same thinking of method acting as you do to product experience, right? So what is the life of the character, the persona of the person using the product? What is their backstory? What are the things they care about? What are the pains that they're feeling and the pressures that they're feeling? And how are you designing a tool which kind of takes a holistic approach towards creating the value for whoever, the problems that are being faced by that customer? And there are many personas that can be using a product, and you have to synthesize all of their stories into what the product is.
Absolutely, and that's completely consistent with how we teach entrepreneurship and innovation these days, or at least one of the models. The lean startup model would certainly say, imagining the experience of the user is very important in terms of understanding the value and potential success of your product. And then at the same time, going beyond that and being able to imagine the company and the organization that you're going to need to deliver that product and the process you're going to go through to sell it. All of these things, imagination is very important to, and it certainly features in the way we would teach it at Waterloo. So your description of the importance of that is very valuable. So you've talked about Tulip, your company. I'm very interested in it too. We're going to talk a bit about that inside the interview. But can you tell the people who are watching what the company does and why it is why it's unique, what its value is?
Yeah. So Tulip is we're a software company that serves the manufacturing industry. So for those who are not familiar with the manufacturing industry in general, you have one kind of big categorization you have between process and discrete manufacturing. Think of as continuous operations, everything from like petrochemical type operations or highly automated, spitting out 2,000 toothbrushes a minute, that kind of thing. In the discrete manufacturing space, you're doing some operation on a product, and then you move to the next station, some other operation takes place. So that's, typically the discrete operations are much more manual, right? And so that's kind of one thing to give some context to the world that Tulip lives in. The second one is that I think contrary to what a lot of people imagine the manufacturing world is like, manufacturing is an extremely living process. It's like what happens within a factory is constantly under some kind of change. That change can come in part is like it's an intentional driven process. Coming from philosophies and teachings of lean operations, where you're constantly trying to improve that process based on data, based off of feedback from the line, based off mechanisms for improving quality, etc. So the line is always changing, and is changing not only from this feedback process of improvement, it's also because the conditions change, because people quit, or demand changes, or a supplier of components changes and they have some different characteristics to it, or what have you. So, historically, lean has, every manufacturer is lean in some way. They're like somewhere on their lean journey, and there's like, it's like a religion, and you have the people who are super orthodox, and you have the people who are really sort of on the liberal end of the spectrum, or they're someplace in their spectrum, but it's very dominant within the world. Now, the tools that are given for lean are fundamentally still analog in a lot of ways. There's a ton of paper that exists within manufacturing world, and with the exception of like high levels of automation, we start to have robotics and computers and specialized machines. But in that discrete world, it's still a lot of people. It's really, really hard to be data driven in that world, because people are very analog, and it's hard to get good, consistent, valuable data out of what's actually happening on the factory floor. And the human condition like makes things challenging, because like, okay, so let's say I'm recording defects, right? If I'm recording defects online, I might like tally mark on a piece of paper. At the end of the day, someone has to like collect and put into Excel and like make a pivot table and make some graphs, and then like they print it out, and then like 2 days later they stick it up on the wall and they discuss what happens, because this is the way that they're doing stuff. But fundamentally, this is just like a really slow process, and it's not a human-centered process. So what Tulip does as what we make as a product is basically a tool for manufacturing engineers online. And it's like a software tool that lets you build very quickly applications to collect data, to guide a process, to error-proof a process, to monitor a machine and couple with a person, and to solve a very specific problem for one station that might exist, or many stations, or a line, or the like, and collect data about what's going on there, so that you can make change, right? Follow some kind of lean continuous improvement process. And so like as an app building platform, the buzzwords part of things is like it's a no code IoT connected application building platform, where the focus here is on the speed for the tool for the manufacturing engineer. So speed to build an app, speed to deploy an app, to collect the data, and to change that application as you're doing this continuous improvement effort. So the last kind of like important bit about this is that it's a software platform that is fundamentally connected to the physical world. So you can connect to sensors and to actuators and tools and machines, so that the apps themselves become interactive. So let's say I'm making I'm making a gyroscope for an airplane, for a commercial airline. So it's a very intricate manual process. I want to have good guidance to that process as I'm doing it, because it's like safety critical, etc. And I want to know that the torque driver that I'm using to screw in that screw is set to exactly the torque that it needs to be for that. And I might incorporate some other airproofing, like poka-yoking, into that is physical, off of tools and sensors that are part of it. So that's what we do.
Okay, so I'm very interested in what you do, because I have a background in lean manufacturing, and one of the dilemmas I always thought was, in order to engage in continuous improvement, you want to be gathering all the data, which the Internet of Things and perhaps other technologies too now enable us to do a lot more than could be done in the past. And at the same time, you want to standardize operations, so that there can be a focus on quality and efficiency and everything else. Basically, you're trying to change while at the same time standardize. And what your technology, as I looked at it, does is to take advantage of the fact that we have a lot more data, which in theory means we can do a lot more improvement. And at the same time, it provides a mechanism or the ability to be able to change in a disciplined, standardized way.
Yeah,
so
it's like a paradox of lean. It's a paradox of lean that, be standard because that's how you're enforcing some kind of quality and expectation about what the quality is of the output that you're going to get. Well, at the same time, it teaches you to change that as quickly as soon as you find value that can come out of it. And you're 100% right in that, like, this is how this tool has kind of been optimized. And one of the challenges is, like, when you do this kind of standards and changes in a fully automated process, it's like, that the automated process is going to do what you tell it to do, barring it breaking. But when it gets to people, then you get a real problem, because now you have some kind of institutional knowledge or muscle memory that exists within that workforce. You have, there's a lot of, John Carrier at MIT calls this the hidden factory. Like, there is the people that know, like, oh yeah, the SOP says set the machine to 30, but it doesn't sound quite right at 30. So if you tweak it up to 32, you actually get a better result. Like, that's not ever captured in any way. It's just in the heads of the craft people who are doing the work. So how do you use data to firmly capture that information? And second, how do you present that to the team so that everybody is actually doing the standard? Because the way that you do it today is you print out some Word doc, or you print out a PowerPoint presentation of what the SOP is, and you say to people, hey, good morning, everybody, team, here's the new SOP, make sure you read it before you do it. But you don't actually know if they're doing it. You don't actually know, because they might have checked off that they did it, but really, I want to put these screws in first because it's more convenient based on where those bins are. And that may be a actual quality problem that comes out of it.
Yep, absolutely. And I saw this with 3 shifts as well. One shift may come up with an improvement. How do you transfer that to other shifts and enable them possibly to contribute to that improvement process too? So yeah, and at the same time, what your technology also seemed to do to me was to enable the Internet of Things to be something that operators were more part of, in the sense that they could see the data being gathered, they would see the changes in their individual practices that may be designed, and it offered the potential, I wasn't sure whether your product did this, but it offered the potential for them also to contribute to the decisions that might be made about how processes would be changed.
Yeah, and I think that's so. When going back a little bit to what I was talking about earlier in connection to the arts and how it feeds in kind of fundamentally to the DNA of what makes the company, is that we're very much a product-centered, customer-centered, human-centered company, right? It's all like, our product is made for people. It's not meant for optimizing abstract machines, kind of as in the big picture. And that also leads to how you approach the deployment of a tool like this. Is that when I go potential customer to introduce the concept, kind of different from the way that software is used in factories. It's always like, they come in talking to engineer or to some management executive sort of thing, but I always want to talk to the operators on the line and bring them very early into the conversation, because they're ultimately like one set of the users of this tool. And like I was saying before about all this institutional knowledge, which is kind of trapped in the brains of the veterans of the workforce, how do you tap this knowledge base and engage them so that they are, they have buy-in, they have ownership over this thing as well. And in some of the customers, you really see it kind of in their DNA as well, where you have the people who are actually creating the SOPs, work instructions, they're not people who are coming in necessarily from an engineering background. They're people who are coming in from the floor, and they work in collaboration with the manufacturing engineers, but they are bringing that ownership. So some of it is, things that we can build into the tool itself about how, giving mechanisms for the actual operating workforce to give feedback to the engineers who may be creating these experiences. Part of it is encompassed within the best practices of kind of like the templates that you give, but that's almost like it's like an adjacent aspect of the tool, right? So in analogy, you could say that like we have and partly how the tool works is it kind of looks like a PowerPoint with you have a canvas that you're putting widgets, and you can add some logic and like onto it. But like PowerPoint, you all have seen great PowerPoint presentations, and you've also seen crappy ones, right? It's like a very powerful tool that you want to wield it in the right way. And so the best we can do for that is to provide like encompass best practices in user experience design and the way that you want to engage with the workforce and like.
Okay, and you've cut out there a little bit. Oh, there you're back now. That's okay. Okay. So companies are using your product now and gaining benefits from it. Could you just tell us a little bit about that, about what they're doing with it now?
Yeah. So the space that we really are in is more in discrete manufacturing. So it's only like half of the world's manufacturing, basically.
It's a good place to start.
But that means we have a very wide customer base in terms of the way that they're using the tool. So on the one hand, like our very first customer was New Balance, right? So they're using Tulip as part of the quality management for apparel production. And they have interesting problems because they are like very, they're high volume, obviously, but they're also very high mix and that high mix between like, a shoe, you can think of it, there's a style, the size, the gender, the sidedness of it. And then you have all the other factors of like, which vendor is putting the, the raw materials, or did you mix the chemicals in the foam so that the density was right, et cetera. So they're like in a constant process of new product introduction because they're moving at the speed of fashion. So that's like one category. Another category is we're working with a bunch of pharmaceutical makers about how do you take a necessarily much more rigid process about the creation of a drug and rethink actually a little bit about how you think about a validation process for that so that you can maintain quality and actually be able to iterate a little faster on it. So an example of that in the pharmaceutical space is, you make drugs typically in batches, right? And I might make, aspirin at 200 milligrams and make it 400 milligrams in my next batch. And between any of those batches, I have to go through a full cleaning process because I can't risk cross-contamination of one batch to another, even though they're using on the same equipment. So, we had one of our customers that's using it is like, they have an 80-page process of an SOP that someone needs to follow in order to do that. They only have 15 minutes to do it. So how do you do that? Like you can't actually do that in some kind of paper form and actually have like you're doing it at quality, you're doing it and it's verified, it's tracked, etc. Because all this becomes part of the batch record of that batch of drugs that is, retained for 20 years. So, so kind of rethinking a little bit of that process. And then, other kind of categories where we're looking at for, ways that customers are using things. It's everything from a contract manufacturing manufacturer that's making fiber optic equipment to a boat maker to making super high-end jewelry. And so we span across all these different industries, and kind of like I said, we have this very general tool, but kind of the way that it's used kind of fits into a bunch of different kind of overall categories. So there's like the class of like things like, standard operating procedures of one sort or another, or auditing applications of one sort or another, or machine monitoring type applications where I have a machine that gives some level of automation, but I want to capture the human expertise about what's going into the setup of that machine, or understanding the quality of the output of that machine. And so kind of the net impact is along the lines of improvements in quality, because a lot of times you can actually eliminate a lot of the human error that comes through better error checking in that baked into the process. Higher throughput of the human operations, because you're getting, again, better guidance, and you have the ability to improve. And then third is that you can train people a lot faster. Where some industries, like if you think about contract manufacturing, they have seasonal changes that maybe the first 2 months of the quarter is quiet, and then like all of a sudden the third month you need to hire a bunch of temps in order to do stuff. And so how do you train them up, the people up fast enough so they can then perform stuff at quality, especially they may turn over very quickly. How this is manifest like for us right now in the midst of a pandemic crisis is how do you scale up operations to take an example of ventilators, where you might be making 3 ventilators a day to making 200. How do you do that? Like you have, talking to one ventilator maker, they literally took their factory and like put it in a truck and put it into a CM because they have more space and they have more people to do it. Now you got to train all these people, etc. So yeah, that's kind of where the different places that we fit in.
Okay, and so what you've described there, I think, is that your technology makes it possible for organizations to change much more quickly, to respond to competition, to introduce new technologies, changes in their processes and things like that, which is, in manufacturing, very important today and likely to be so in the future, especially, if we're going to be seeing things like countries being concerned to reduce outsourcing to other countries. That's going to change in manufacturing. If automation comes as part of that, as they try to reduce costs, with higher labor costs in richer countries. So that would also be a place where your technology would be relevant. So it seems very suited to the challenges companies are facing today.
One of the other things is that that happens is that there's this weird dead zone in the sense of where, let's say I'm making a new product, right? When I make it at some lower volumes, then obviously I'm going to be making that with people. And when I'm making it at super high volumes, it makes sense for me to take an investment in some kind of automation to reduce the cost to make it. But in between the low volumes and the super high volumes, it gets really tricky, because then you have you have to either hire a lot of people, or you're investing in a lot of equipment that may not bear itself out in terms of that capital cost. So one of the things that systems like Tulip can do is enable you to maintain a human workforce, human-driven workforce at a lower cost as these volumes are increasing, and what that gives you is also a lot more resiliency, because it's like the best computer vision system on the factory floor is the one in between the ears of your people. And so, and you can, I could, I can explain like how to make a breakfast in a couple of sentences to a person, and I can't teach a computer to do that. So, so it gives a lot more resiliency to a manufacturer if they can maintain this and maintain their workforce. And just say, how do you do that in a way that's cost effective?
Okay, and been better at using your technology, more successful at introducing it. I'm sure, it's had benefits for most of them. You might say all, but some probably have been more successful than others. What does a company need to do to best take advantage of the technology that you have?
I think those that have been most successful, it's been like ultimately like a people issue more so than anything, right? Those that have been most successful have two characteristics. One, they have kind of a top-down leadership support for empowering people and giving them a place to experiment and fail. Like that's kind of like one key driver for or observation about places that have been successful. And kind of related to that is that they identify who are the right personas within the organization that will are passionate and are going to run with something and show demonstrate and build support within an organization to make some kind of real change happen. So and they exist. Those personas exist everywhere. There's always the hacker type in a factory. The people who they're when they get off work and they have a little wood shop or whatever. Example of that is in manufacturing, a very common sort of thing that you see is a pick to light system. So basically you have a bunch of bins and you don't know which parts to take, so you put little lights underneath the bins and they light up at the right moment for what you need to take at that time, right? Typically those things, it's kind of mind-blowing to me, but they end up being super expensive for whatever reason. And so I remember visiting a factory and they were so proud of this, and I was like, this is amazing. This guy just hacked together some Christmas lights and really went to Home Depot, bought out a way to do it and build a homegrown something like that. So they're these creative people within the organizations that you just need to the companies that are know who those people are and are willing to empower them and give them the space to do stuff is the ones that are ultimately most successful. And the kind of the importance on that top-down support is also critical, because a lot of the getting stuff working effectively is coming through iterations, right? And it's to take an example of stuff that we've seen, a company might start from a paper process, tallying quality issues on paper, right, on some form, and then gathering them. So the first version of the app that they might build on Tulip is a digital version of that paper form, right? It's you still have a bunch of data entry. You have an advantage, you don't have to transcribe it, and you have real-time information, so that's great. You already have some benefit there. But what I've seen in the evolution of that is that you completely replace the whole paradigm of capturing the stuff in digital paper, and you turn something completely different, right? So now let's show an image of the product, and all you have to do is touch the part of the image where the defect is, right? So I reduce cognitive load on just sitting there and reading. Where do I put the tally mark and something to something that's just look at the thing and touch it. And so that only happens through iteration. That only happens through the feedback from the people on the ground. And you need some space to do that, because you'll have you can brainstorm 15 ideas, and then 5 of them will be flops, 5 of them will be okay, and 5 of them will be fantastic ideas. And you just need to be able to fail a little bit.
Okay, I got two more questions. The first one is, you've talked a lot about people and their and the way the technology works with them, I guess. I'm interested in what their reaction has been, what the impact is on the jobs of the people who are affected or use the technology itself. How have they responded to it?
So I think generally, I'd say people have responded well to it. I think the reason why people have responded well has been oftentimes the use cases of what we do are take some kind of tedious thing away. Like, for example, tallying, impacts and like typing stuff into Excel again, right? So it just makes life better. The second thing I think fundamentally my experience has been is that the people that I talk here about the end user, I'm talking about the operators on the line. They really they want to make a quality good thing, and so giving them a tool that helps them do that is good. And they get behind it, and especially when they start to see that they can be listened to. So that's kind of like adding the approach to how you start deploying the system. I spoke about inviting them in early to all the conversations, that they're really participants in the system. There are differences that vary nation to nation. So, for example, in Germany, there are classes of information that you cannot legally capture, right? A classic thing in manufacturing is doing time studies, right? How long does each step in the process take? Because use that to do line balancing so that you don't have bottlenecks within the line. So doing that on an individual basis, not possible to do it in Germany. It's not legal to do it. And so there are some things that the system, you basically have to turn off that capability and that's you just adapt to whatever the kind of local constraints of it are. But I think ultimately, ultimately the system will not be successful if you don't get buy-in from the users. And so it's imperative that you bake into the process of deployment a high level of engagement with the actual end users, and that's just it's just good product design, anyways. Absolutely. But part of that we have to teach that in sometimes, right? Because like I was saying, with PowerPoint, you can give a very powerful tool to a bad PowerPoint maker and have some really terrible presentations. Right? So you try to sort of bake that in.
Yeah, absolutely. And my last question then is, for people who are engineers and technologists today who are going to be watching this, they're about to enter the workforce. What sort of advice would you have for them going into manufacturing today?
I think for the folks that are entering the manufacturing workforce today, there is amazing opportunity, because one is the reality is, I think the manufacturing industry is in some level of appeal, whether it be through global forces that we're seeing happening in the moment. Part of it is because the internet is finally arriving in the factory in a way that it hasn't until very, very recently. This is things like acceptance of the cloud as being able to connect to factories, or basically I think the ongoing failure of certain categories of software, like the whole manufacturing execution systems, is just failed in a lot of ways, and is now being subsumed by new categories of software, like what Tulip is doing. So there's a tremendous opportunity. And the other thing that's happening is, for those entering into the manufacturing space, is that there's such a need for people because all of these skilled people are retiring, and there is such a gigantic hole in the workforce for people to come in and bring, you know, new ideas, new new expertise into the system. So I'm like very positive for folks that are coming into manufacturing. And if I thought back, if you were to ask me 10 years ago, would this be, you know, a space that I don't know if I would have answered yes. But it's also it's a lot more fun than the me 10 years ago would have imagined. I feel super lucky because like I get to visit factories like one day, like see how chocolate's made, and like the next day I go see how like radar's made, and so it's like a little bit of like living in the TV show of how is it made, which is pretty cool.
Absolutely. When I was early in my career, I got to visit lots of companies as well. I had a job that allowed me to do that. And I had exactly the same reaction to it. You know, it was fascinating to see the different ways that different companies operated, the way different things were made, but also the different approaches that were taken to that. They might be making something very similar, and yet they were organized and managing that very differently, and that was it was very interesting to see. I really appreciate you talking to me, Ronny. This has been very valuable, I think, for the students at Waterloo. What you've described things very richly, and you know, there are a lot of things that they can learn from what you've said. So, thank you for taking the time to do it today.
Pleasure.
Okay.